Hello, everyone, and welcome to the next installment of the Galen Data Medical Device Innovation Webinar Series. My name is Abbas Dalawala. I'm the Chief Technology Officer at Galen Data, and I'll be your host today. Today, we'll be hearing from Kristen Mittal, founder and CEO of Mittal Consulting, for a conversation on how to navigate the regulatory regime in 2025. What are the opportunities and associated risk for medical device companies? We'll discuss key strategies, considerations, common pitfalls to avoid, and regulation affecting digital health and AI. But first, few housekeeping items and a little information on Galen Data. Galen Data provides an FDA-compliant cloud for medical device manufacturers. The Galen Cloud provides a configurable platform for device-to-cloud connectivity that is compliant to FDA, HIPAA, and CE mark standards. We are ISO 13485 certified, and our product on AWS is HITRUST certified. Funded by seasoned medical device professionals, our goal is to make medical device cloud connectivity available to all at a fraction of cost while shaving months of development timeline. Galen Data allows medical device companies to stay medical device companies and not become IT companies. Finally, some quick logistics. As we're going through this, if you have any questions, you can type those in the Q&A sections available through the sidebar, either on your left or right-hand side. We'll ask those questions to Kristen at the end, or if appropriate, I'll bring up during our conversation. There's also some handouts on the control panel with more information on Galen Data and a white paper on cloud connectivity. A reminder that a copy of this webinar will be sent to you via email. We'll also be using some polls during the presentation. So when a poll pops up, if you can, please answer those questions. That will help us tailor this presentation to better fit your needs. That being said, I would like to introduce our guest, Kristen. Kristen Mittal, while she brings up our presentation, Kristen Mittal has a background in biomedical engineering and is also a RAC and PMP certified. She spent time in a variety of companies through her career, from genetic engineering to numerous types of devices, to give her a broad perspective of the industry. In her current role as co-founder and CEO of Mittal Consulting, she and her team work with a wide variety of class 1, 2, and 3 medical device companies to bring from ideation to commercialization. Over the years, some type of devices she has worked, or the Mittal team has worked, has been ophthalmologic, neurologic, gynecologic, orthopedic, radiologic, and AI. Welcome, Kristen. Maybe start with a quick introduction on Mittal Consulting.
All right, thanks so much for having me, Abbas. Really nice to be here and speak with you all today. So today we're going to talk, as Abbas said, a little bit about FDA regulations in 2025, specifically for medical device OEMs. And I'll talk a little bit about what we do, and then we'll jump right into the agenda. So at Mittal Consulting, we hone in on regulatory for medical device companies. We work with them from the beginning, from the reimbursement and regulatory strategy, to put a good roadmap together, which will then execute throughout potentially many-year relationship together through regulatory submissions. So our bread and butter are really novel, complex medical devices that are going through at least 510K all the way up to PMA types of submissions. So because we work with novel and complex devices, we do quite a bit of de novo classifications and breakthrough as well. We'll talk a little bit about that later. Throughout this process, since we work with a lot of startups, we often do the project management for these companies as well, to make sure that all the deliverables that are coming in from all the different service providers are coming in appropriate quality and timing, so that they can make sure that we submit on time and have all the deliverables ready and available on time. Additionally, after that, once we've gotten the company on the market, we're happy to support them on the post-market side through registration and listing, letters to file, memos to file, PMA supplements, whatever they need until they can get a large enough team put together that they can handle it on themselves. So we generally have very long-term relationships with our clients, spanning a couple of years all the way up to many, many years. The other offering that we also have is VC due diligence. So as VC firms are looking to bring in new medical device products into their portfolio, we work to do a due diligence assessment of the regulatory strategy and inform them of any potential risks that might be on the pathway or other pathways available from a regulatory perspective. All right, so these are, like I said, some of the types of submissions we do quite regularly. We do a high volume of Q subs, or also known as pre-subs, to the FDA. When we do these, our focus is really on building a relationship with the FDA reviewer so that we know, especially for these novel and complex devices, it's going to be a long-term relationship. So we want to start the company off on the right foot with the FDA and continue that relationship through the entire review process. And then other ones here, de novo, breakthrough, PMA, 510K, IDE, all of these we do quite regularly, and we're going to talk quite a bit about on the following slides. All right, so the biggest, I'm going to start the presentation with, I'm sure, what all of you are very concerned about is what's going on at the FDA right now. I'm sure you've seen lots of news these last couple months of different things happening, FDA employees coming and going. We've been keeping up quite a bit with it, so I'll share some facts about it. But first, Abbas just started a poll. I'm curious to see how many of you have been affected, your companies in particular have been affected by the changes so far.
Right, results are coming in. About 1/3 are in. So I'll give another 30 seconds.
Yeah, and don't be shy. We'll have quite a few poll questions throughout
Yeah.
the presentation to keep it somewhat interesting. I know regulatory can get a little bit dry, so we'll try to keep it from that.
All right, 2/3 are in. Let's give another 15 seconds. Hi. So far, about 70-ish% saying too early to tell. About quarter or 25% are negatively impacted, and about the rest are positively impacted. So I guess we're still figuring out what this means.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, great. Well, I'll go over a little bit about what's happened specifically at the CDRH review branch so far, which is the review branch for medical devices. So, about a month back, about 10% of the CDRH workforce was laid off. They specifically targeted probationary workers. So, these were any workers who had been hired in the last 2 years or had received a promotion in the last 2 years. This disproportionately affected certain product areas that were more recently formed. So this includes AI ML, of course, radiology, and a couple other review groups. However, after this happened, there was quite a bit of pushback from industry groups, including AdvaMed and MDMA, especially since more than half of these workers that were laid off were actually funded by user fees that companies pay with their submissions as opposed to governmental funds. So because of quite a bit of pushback, there was actually about a week or two later, there was a quiet rehiring of many of these CDRH workers who had been laid off. And some of them chose to come back. Some of them chose that this was a good time to leave and pursue other opportunities. So that definitely had quite a bit of effect on the workers at FDA, especially in the CDRH branch. The other factor that's factoring in here is at the same time, all remote work policies that had been in place for many decades at the FDA had been rescinded. So everyone was told to come back to the office by a certain date. As the White Oak campus was never really meant to house all the FDA workers, once they did come back, there was incredible amount of issues between parking and trying to find places for people to work. I think people even worked in the kitchen or the pantries, I've been told. So it was quite a debacle. But since then, I think they really saw how much of a debacle this was. And so FDA's temporarily relaxed their in-office work requirements for some of the employees. And I think they're trying to find a new balance accordingly. So this is some of the big headlines. What does this all mean for us? It means right now there's a lot of changes at the FDA, and likely as FDA reviewers are coming and going, many of these files may be somewhat understaffed. So that means in the short term, there's going to be likely less review time per file for the FDA reviewers who decide to stay. So what we can do from our perspective is, of course, we make our submissions good to begin with, but make them exceptional, make them so easy to read, put tables in there, put executive summaries everywhere we can, so that it's a no-brainer that they can approve them, that it doesn't introduce new questions. Let's spend the extra time making sure our files are extra buttoned up so that if they need to spend less time reviewing a file, they can still get all the facts they need in that certain amount of time. Also, what we see will likely happen in the next 3 to 6 months, we may see somewhat longer review times on some files, as they try to find replacements for some FDA reviewers who have left and get up to speed on these files. So we'll see more in the coming months how it affects. All right, so I wanted to get ahead of that just to speak about it, and happy to speak more about it at the end of the presentation as well in the questions if you have specific ones. I know there was also an LDT rule that came out. It got struck down yesterday finally, so looks like for now going forward that guidance has been off the table, and LDTs will not be converted to IVDs anytime in the future. So I think that's going to go through some more litigation. But for today's agenda, we're going to start with 4 things. We're going to start with a quick overview of medical device regulations. I know most of you on the call are pros at this already, but for those of you who are a little bit newer, we're going to give you a quick refresher. Then we'll jump into some of the key regulatory strategy considerations you should definitely be considering for 2025. We'll talk about some special FDA pilot programs, and then in general, we'll sum up with some overall thoughts on commercialization strategies from a regulatory perspective. So first and foremost, I'm sure all of you have seen this figure many times, but these are the various stages of device commercialization. So I'll have Abbas open a poll. I'm curious to see where each of you are at on this steps 1 through 5. And while he opens it, I'll also just walk through it a little bit as well. So step 1 is device discovery and concept. This is when you're very early on in researching a new device and you're still in the laboratory, perhaps at a university or incubator place. Once you've gotten enough data and you feel confident that the device does work, then you move on to step 2, which is preclinical research prototype. This is where devices undergo laboratory and animal testing to really answer basic questions about the safety profile. Step 3 is the pathway to approval, where devices are really functionally tested from a V&V perspective, potentially clinical studies if needed, to make sure to really prove that they're safe and effective. Once all that data is collected, you move on to step 4, where you actually submit to the FDA, so FDA review, and work with the FDA to get an approval from them. And then step 5 is FDA post-market safety monitoring, where you continue to monitor of your device while it's on the market. All right, do we have poll results in?
Yeah, we have about half the audience has voted. It's about an even split between step 2 and step 3, 30% in each, about 15% in step 1, 15% in step 5, and then a step 4 at FDA review, about 10%. So a good mix, I guess, between step 1 and 5, but a large majority in that step 2 to 4.
Okay, great. So we've got a pretty good mix on the call. That's great. And while we're looking at this slide, what I want to say is regulatory, although it's of course going to be heaviest in step 4 and 3 and 4, really you should be engaging with regulatory experts throughout the entire process. And the startups that we see who do that, even from as early as the end of step 1, we generally find them have the most long-term success, just because they're setting themselves up for success from the beginning in terms of the types of testing they choose to do, what types of scientific questions they're trying to answer in these tests, and just getting their paperwork and systems on board and ready for the FDA submission as well. All right, so now let's do a quick refresher of medical device classification in the US. So this is my quick pitch slide of trying to show you all in comprehensive. So FDA CDRH review branch separates devices into three classes, class 1, 2, and 3. And class 1 is your lowest risk, and class 3 is your highest risk. So it's risk-based classification from 1 to 3. So class 1, although it's only about 10% of submissions to the FDA, it represents more than half of the market. So likely you've used class 1 medical devices throughout your general daily routine and you haven't even known about it. So examples of these are things like bandages, latex gloves, surgical masks, stethoscopes. I could really go on and on forever here. But these are your lowest risk devices, and 510K is generally not required. So that's why I say 10% of submissions by FDA are class 1 is because that's the exception. The ones that are class 1 but do require 510K and then get pre-review by the FDA. And they're subject, just like all classes of devices, subject to general controls, and this may be with or without exemptions. All right. Class 2 devices represents the bulk of FDA reviews. This is about 80% of submissions to the FDA. And Class 2, you usually think 510K. Those are somewhat synonymous, although de novos are becoming more and more common, especially with AI SAMD devices, which FDA is pushing into de novo land more and more. So examples of these are catheters, contact lenses, electronic wheelchairs, and thermometers. And the wheelchair one is an interesting one because this actually exemplifies the risk level from 1, 2, and 3. So manual wheelchairs are actually in class 1 because they're the lowest risk. They don't have that electrical component. But electronic wheelchairs fall into class 2 because they have that electronical component that could malfunction and provide some risk. And I don't know if you guys have heard of stair stepper wheelchairs, but there actually are wheelchairs that will go up and down stairs. These are actually fall into class 3 because they present the most risk if it malfunctions. The potential for injury of going down the steps is quite large. So that's just an example of how one single product can potentially fall into 3 different categories depending upon its level of complication and its risk level. But class 2 is the most common. It's what FDA reviews most frequently, and they're subject to general and special controls, and this may be with or without exemptions. And then finally, class 3 is your highest risk devices. So think something implantable, life-sustaining. So things like implantable pacemakers and defibrillators, spinal cord stimulators. This almost always requires a PMA. Occasionally, companies will submit an HDE instead, and this always requires a clinical study. So this is going to be a very long time to market because you have to independently prove safety and efficacy, where you don't independently have to do that in class 1 or class 2. So these are subject to general controls and pre-market approval and represent 10% of the about 10% of the submissions to the FDA. So this is going to be a very long, involved process. All right, now that we quickly covered classifications in the US, we're going to go over a couple different strategies that you should be aware of when you're categorizing your device. So one of them is up and down classifying, one is whether to file a de novo, and then lastly, 513G versus QSUP. All right, so the first thing as you're founding your medical device company and you're starting to think about regulatory strategy, especially when you have a novel or complex device and you're early on and figuring out the indications for a use statement, you may have multiple pathways available to you that you don't even realize. So oftentimes we'll come across companies that are on the border of class 1, class 2, or class 2, class 3 sometimes, but less common. So if you're on the border, it can come down to a lot of different factors, but some of these reasons you might want to up classify to class 2 510K if you have the option is you want to box out some competition. So you may be concerned that there's a lot of competitors entering the market. You want to distinguish yourself, raise the bar a bit. So we've had some companies successfully execute this strategy to really increase the barrier to entry by requiring more testing for certain types of devices. You may also want to upclassify if you need stronger marketing claims to be able to successfully sell to a target audience. So if you need to say things a bit stronger in terms of disease states or intended use populations, you may need to upclassify to a 510K here as well. Situations where you may want to downclassify to a Class 1 510K exempt product would be you're looking to enter the market a little bit more slowly. You maybe need to generate some funding from the product first, see how it does on the market, get some preliminary data, and then use that momentum to upclassify it at a later point. Or you may choose not to. You may choose that it just works with that strategy. Or you may want to sell direct to consumer anyway, and the indications for use statement is not as critical to your specific product type. So those are really common situations we deal with. Less common, but also it happens situations would be devices on the border of Class 2, Class 3. So situations where you may want to propose upclassifying to Class 3 PMA. This used to be more common, but has become less common now, simply because of the much longer time to market on a PMA company. However, given that PMAs do take the longest time to get to market due to their requirements for independent safety and efficacy, this is by far the most effective way to box out competition from a regulatory perspective. So statistically speaking, PMAs are generally much more successful on the market than 510Ks percentage-wise. And that is because they've done a significant more amount of testing and time before they got to the market. The more common situation we work with companies is trying to figure out how to down classify from Class 3 to Class 2 510K de novo. This is trickier in general because you're going to need full FDA's buy-in here. But if you are able to successfully get the FDA buy-in by showing them a lower risk profile in actuality or a significant amount of data on the market that's proven a lower risk profile, then the time to market will be shorter and the testing burden will likely be much less. So these, again, FDA has to buy into all your strategies here, but there's a lot of different ways you can play with indications for use statement or even how you design the device to put you into a different category. So that's why it's good to chat with regulatory from the very beginning to get really clear on what your pathway is so everyone's working in the same direction. All right. Another question we get a lot is to de novo or not to de novo. So companies that are on the border of 510K de novo, let me say from the beginning, in the end, it's the FDA's decision which pathway you go down. But now you're thinking, hey, do I argue for 510K or do I argue from the beginning for de novo? So let's talk about it. So the de novo regulations changed in 2021, making this a much more efficient pathway. So since 2021, we've seen a significant uptick in the number of de novos. And like I said earlier, a lot more AI SAMD devices are getting converted to de novo by the FDA, simply because they do want to see that clinical data. So the risks of doing a de novo is that the burden of proof will be higher for your company, than any other company, because you have to independently prove, and then subsequent companies can 510K off of your de novo and reach the market much faster than you initially did. So knowing that, you should preemptively be aware about it and make sure that as soon as you get on the market, you're ready to capitalize as much as you can. Some benefits of pursuing the de novo pathway is sometimes you can creatively write your special controls to try to box out some competition and make the barrier a little bit higher for the next companies coming on. And it allows you much more freedom in how you write your indications for use statement. You're not tied to a predicate indications for use statement. So this can potentially open up a whole new avenue for marketing to the industry that wasn't available before. And here's a graph of de novos through the years since the change in regulation in 2021 and how it's looking for 2025. We've had 47 granted in 2024. So far, we've only had 3 granted in 2025. For Q1 of last year, it was 12, so we're a little bit behind. Don't know if this has to do with all the changes in regulations the last couple months, but we'll see in the coming months how it shakes out. And nevertheless, we're still seeing meetings happening at the FDA. We're still seeing files being reviewed. Products are still coming in.
One question on this increase is, do you know if it's because the FDA is pushing more to the de novo pathway versus 510K, or is it more companies wanting to go to the de novo pathway? Like which one is driving the increased trend?
It's both. We've seen both. So some companies have been pushed into it by the FDA, and sometimes we see that as a silver blessing. And then sometimes companies have on their own chosen for a variety of reasons to shape their device so that it's eligible for the de novo pathway to really become distinguished. So I think it's been about equally both.
Cool.
All right. And then one other strategy to think about is when you're very early on and you're trying to figure out where you fall and what your categorization is, should you do a 513G versus a pre-submission or a Q-sub? So Abbas has another poll. Maybe he can open up. I'm curious to see if any of you have had experience with a 513G before or have even heard of it.
Okay, put one third in, so give some time. Hi, about two-thirds are in. 80% are, sorry, 40-40. So 40% no, we don't do those, or other 40% has never heard of this. And then there's about 10% saying positive experience, another 10% saying negative experience.
Okay, great. So we've got both about equally positive and negative experience. That's kind of what I expected. Okay. So I want to get ahead of this by talking about 513Gs to plan it all in your mind because a lot of our international clients use them quite a bit and we've sometimes had problems. So a 513G is a request for information. I like to call it a request for designation. It's basically you write up a description of your device and you put it to the FDA and you say, FDA, please categorize this for me. There's really no room for interaction or clarification, and there's a fee associated with it. So one for small biz, one for standards on the screen. And I say the decision status here is binding. It's called a formal decision. It acts kind of like a binding decision. So you can come back from the decision, but it's somewhat difficult. On the opposite side, pre-submission, a Q-sub, you do the same thing. You write up and talk about your device. And the idea is you ask questions to FDA of scientific valid questions you have. One of these questions could be, hey, this is the FDA classification I'm planning on pursuing or the regulatory strategy. Do you agree? So you can essentially achieve the same data or endpoint here as a 513G under a Q-sub, but the benefits here would be that it does allow for interaction and clarification in case they didn't fully understand your initial device description. You can clarify this through the teleconference process or in person. And the other important thing here is that there is a benchmark set under MDUFA of 70 days for written feedback. So there's a timeline for FDA to review these and provide you feedback, while there's no timelines for 513Gs. So we've seen some companies wait even more than 2 years to get a response back for their 513G. And given the fact that some of these files We'll likely have longer review times this year due to staffing issues. 513G will likely be one of these programs affected as well, since there's no set review times required for these files. Additionally, there's no cost associated with a pre-submission, while there is a cost associated with the 513G. So sometimes it goes fine, but many times we've had situations which are really hard to come back from. One time we've had a company that was miscategorized as a drug instead of a device. Another time we've had a company that was severely late to market due to extended review times on a 513G. So just want to proactively get this in front of you that pre-submission pathway or QSub is also a great way to obtain the same type of information in a potentially less risky pathway. So FDA will always be required to tell you about your option to be able to submit a 513G. It doesn't mean you have to exercise that option.
Is there a limitation on how many times you can do the Q subs?
No, you can do as many Q subs as you want, so long as you have really legitimately valid scientific questions where you can have an intellectual discussion with the FDA. So I've even known of one company for a very, very complex products who's done 22 pre-submissions before going to market. That's not your typical, that's definitely on the higher end, but it can be a very useful process to go through.
Cool.
All right. And then the last part of this, second part of this, I want to talk about some special FDA programs at the FDA. These are STEP, Breakthrough, and TAP. So, Abbas, if you'd like to pull up a poll question, I'm curious if any of you have had experience with any of these programs or even heard of any of them before.
Okay, about half are in. Let's give another 15 seconds.
Sure, sounds good.
Okay, seems like about 24% say they use breakthrough designation. About 9% have used TAP, and about 5% have used TAP. 32% knowledgeable, and about 27% have never heard of any of these.
Okay, also a great breakup. So it's nice to see quite a few of you have used the breakthrough pathway already, and quite a few of you haven't heard about it. So we're going to go through it. So breakthrough device designation, the reason it came about was to accelerate communication with the FDA on devices that offer a more effective treatment of life-threatening or irreversibly debilitating diseases or conditions. So, like we were just chatting, Abbas, earlier about the pre-submission process, sometimes devices are so complex you have to do 22 pre-submissions before you're ready for the final marketing application. Well, given the fact that it takes 70 days, a couple months to put together the pre-sub and 70 days to get that feedback, that can really extend your timeline quite a bit. So that's a perfect example of where breakthrough is really helpful to, the purpose is to shorten the amount of time it takes to get information and ask questions and get answers from the FDA. So this can be achieved through sprint discussions, priority review. However, the thing to keep in mind is that the operating word here is more effective. So the burden of proof has gone up. Breakthrough is much more challenging now in 2024 and especially in 2025 to get, simply because initially we had companies back in 2019 who were kind of accidentally getting breakthrough. Some of them didn't even apply and got it. But now we have to put together very well written, data driven. You can't just win it on a logical argument. Now you need the data to also support it. because I mean you can see there was an incredible increase in breakthrough over the last couple of years applications. And what FDA found is that those companies who applied and got it on a logical argument, once they went and did their clinical studies, a lot of times that logical argument didn't pan out and they weren't actually more effective than the current standard of care. So FDA felt that was somewhat a waste of their review resources when it actually didn't pan out. So they're being much more selective about who they allow in. But like I said, benefits are shorter time to be able to get feedback from FDA through sprint discussions, priority review. Your file goes on the top of the pile. And we've analyzed it. There's statistically shorter review times. So for 510K, you get the same average review time, but you would expect a longer one given that these are all novel devices. So that's actually quite good. For de novo, we see the most benefits, 6 months shorter review time on average, and for PMA, we see 3 months shorter review time on average. To get this designation, there's no FDA fee required and quite a bit of potential marketing benefits if you can get it early on. Uh, but do know that you should at least do one pre-submission before you apply for breakthrough device designation. That's what FDA has been asking for most recently, to get introduced to your device before you then go argue for this.
One quick question on this. If you do get a breakthrough device designation, is it more likely that the FDA pushes you into the kind of the de novo PMA, well, mostly de novo if you're kind of class 2 pathway? Because, I mean, that's the logic, right? It's a breakthrough, it's novel, it's different. Or do you not see that push?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and it's the first one that comes to mind when you think about novel. But actually, we've seen about half of the breakthroughs are 510Ks on the market. So on the surface, it seems like a conundrum, but actually how it's written, the specific language of breakthrough more effective compared to current standard of care makes it quite open to be able to use for any of the pathways.
Cool.
All right. The other potentially very useful thing of qualifying for breakthrough is then you can potentially apply for TAP if you're eligible. So FDA found the issue with very novel devices, which are breakthrough, having a hard time once they finally got onto market, called the Valley of Death, where they get through the FDA, but then they can't sell. And that's because they hadn't figured out how to really sell from a reimbursement perspective or specialty societies. So FDA put this pilot program that while you're going through FDA review and you've got breakthrough eligibility, you can optionally apply for TAP. And then your lead reviewer, if you get accepted, your lead reviewer can connect you for free with reimbursement experts, specialty societies, patient organizations, in the idea that you have these conversations early on throughout your review so that by the time you get to the market, you're more or less ready and able to start selling at that point. So there's certain eligible device categories I've shown on the screen, and they've continued to expand it, just most recently with including the orthopedic device branch as well. There's no fee required for this, and it sounds like a couple of the companies on this call have already gone through this process as well. All right, and then last but not least is the Safer Technologies Program, also known as STEP. And this accelerates communication with the FDA on devices that offer significantly safer treatment or diagnosis of diseases or conditions. So this is basically the program. If you're not eligible for breakthrough, then consider applying for STEP if you've got some good data from a safety perspective. This FDA is not as excited about this program, although we do know companies who have gone through it and been able to get the same benefits. One important benefit is starting in October this year, STEP will also be eligible for TAP, and that can be really beneficial for certain companies. All right, the last part I'm going to leave in this seminar is overarching commercial strategies, just really thinking more about the big picture from AI and cybersecurity perspective, international markets, and just a holistic approach. So digital health, AI, and cybersecurity are all huge buzzwords right now the last couple of years with the FDA, and all have very unique considerations. So Digital health and medical devices, when you have a product here, you really need to think, is this going to be regulated by FDA or is it a general wellness device? So that's the first question you need to be thinking here. And if I have the option of both pathways, what's the best pathway from my commercialization perspective to meet my end goals from a marketing perspective? So that's generally what we walk through companies with from this. Cybersecurity, I can't not mention this. This is absolutely huge. FDA has incredibly increased review of cybersecurity over the last couple years. And it's just pertinent you work with firms who know what they're doing. Otherwise, they will reject it back and you will have to do it again. And with the new guidance document, cybersecurity is no longer a action that you just take like a checkbox. It's something that should be really integrated through your entire quality management system. FDA should be able to see that you're thinking about it the whole time. AI is huge. We're helping tons of companies with either AI, SAMD, or just incorporating AI into their hardware software platforms. FDA has guidances out for this, and they're also just really looking at this from situation to situation based. So every application they're reviewing uniquely, but big picture items you should be thinking about is how am I controlling for bias? What types of data sets am I training on? What types of data sets am I retraining on? And all of that it needs to be taken seriously. And then finally, software as a medical device. These are software platforms that have medical purposes, but they're not part of a hardware medical device. And if you have a medical claim here, this will be regulated by FDA. And you go through the same process, except you just don't have the hardware. All right, I like to keep this slide in because a lot of startups ask us, well, what's the right pathway? And for every type of company and their in commercialization goals is going to be different. But I'm just showing a general pathway many of our companies end up following. Usually they start out on the US market because, with European market, there's been quite a bit of change in regulations and costs and timing, less clarity and predictability. So many of our companies that used to go Europe first are now going US first. And once you've gotten on the US market, then companies think about the European market, which is under EU MDR for medical devices under the new regulation, and IVDR for in vitro diagnostics. They may also consider Canadian market under Health Canada about the same time. And then rest of world is usually a little bit later on once they've gotten some money and generated quite a bit of presence in these first couple markets. However, if you have a humanitarian type of device or you have a very affordable type of device, rest of world may make sense to go first depending on your product type and market fit.
For the Health Canada, do you see companies going like an MD-SAP route so they can cover Australia, Canada,
Yes,
and other things too?
absolutely. Yeah,
And
yeah. Japan and Australia are also right up there as well, and Brazil.
have you seen? I know we are very early in this new administration, but is there talk about essentially flipping that back because of maybe uncertainties in terms of timeline and FDA in terms of how long it will take to review to essentially open up again the European market first? Or is this the shift that we saw a couple of years ago or 3 years ago from Europe to US is pretty much solidified?
Yeah, that's a great question. There's a lot of talks about it right now. I don't think anyone has actually shifted yet because, to be honest, we haven't seen that much longer of review times yet. Most of our FDA reviewers have been assuring us that it's going to be business as usual. They're going to try to insulate themselves from changes as much as possible. So we haven't seen it yet, but it's definitely, this is like, let's see what happens in the next 3 to 6 months. Everyone's kind of sitting on their edges of the seats to see how it actually shakes out. All right, and then one last thing I want to leave you guys with is the number one thing we see startups have the most success when they not only consider regulatory from the beginning, but they also consider reimbursement and market access. Really, all of these three things should be discussed at the beginning, and one unified strategy should be pursued from the beginning. This is what we really see make or break companies. The cheapest regulatory pathway is not necessarily always the best pathway in the long-term interest of the company. So trying to figure out what's the most critical aspects need to be incorporated from a market access perspective, a marketing perspective, what types of phrasing do we need in the IFU from a reimbursement perspective to get them on board? What types of endpoints do we need to see in our clinical studies from a reimbursement perspective to get the reimbursers on board? And how do we incorporate that and create a unique regulatory pathway with all of those elements combined? So this is how you should really be thinking about it from the beginning to get the maximum out of your journey. And then this is just a quick plug for us. We have quite a bit of a trusted partner network, quite a different service providers that we work with. I mean, usually we work with medical device startups who are new to the industry and don't have these connections. So we're happy to put you in touch with other connections for the different services as needed as you get to that stage to make sure you can be set up for success and you're getting good data to put in your FDA submissions. All right. Thank you. So that's the end of the presentation, and I'm excited to hear what questions you guys have. Here's our QR codes as well of myself and our co-founder. Please connect with us on LinkedIn. We'd love to chat with you outside of this presentation as well.
Thank you, Kristen. If you have any questions, please type it in the Q&A box on the control panel, and we'll start answering those. There's already a few that have come in, so I'm going to switch. Let me just switch first. I guess it doesn't really matter. All right, here you go. I think you already answered this question, but how will the downsizing of the FDA staff affect medical device review timelines? I guess unknown at this point.
Yeah, we expect it'll shake out in the next 3 to 6 months because FDA reviewers are still slowly coming and going. We know some of them, have not left yet, but they do plan to leave in the next couple months. So I think we won't know for at least 3 months what the full effect is, but we have quite tight reviews, communication with our FDA reviewers, and so far we've only seen a couple meetings push by maybe a week or so. And otherwise, it's been business as usual.
All right, this may be a little tricky, but the question is, if I justify a device as a class one when it's on that border between class one and class two, what is the regulatory risk if and when the under-resourced FDA comes back years from now and says that I should have submitted a 510K because it's really a class two?
Yeah, so there's a lot of situations where it's genuinely on the border. So if you can genuinely make an argument for class one exempt, and when you do that, you need to put together a memo to file justifying your rationale. You need to have that put together, very well written, signed off by upper management to show that you didn't just choose one arbitrarily. You actually did your due diligence to support it. Um, this will be potentially reviewed during audits. FDA review, even if you're a class one device, you're still going to have audits by the FDA. So this will be reviewed at some point, and FDA may agree or disagree. But if you have that well written, they can understand why you made that decision to begin with. So that helps de-risk it quite a bit.
Cool. This is another question around FDA's resources. Is there a feeling that the FDA might cut corners to meet timelines for reviews, specifically for class one and class two?
It's unknown as of yet, but from our experience and the reviews we've been receiving, that's not what we've been seeing at all.
A question about SAMD. You mentioned that this could be potential class 3 SAMD. Is an example of what a class 3 SAMD would be?
Uh, Example of a class 3 software as a medical device? Off the top of my head, I don't know if I can come up with one, but is there an example?
Yeah, I don't know either. I think it's a little bit tough to be a software only device. with a class 3 life-sustaining, or yeah, I don't know. It's not, but that might be one. Another question about AI. So how does the question, sorry, where did the question go? Yeah. How does the FDA classify what constitutes an AI? Is it any software that provides any diagnosis, or is there a specific guideline on what is AI?
Yeah, so that's another thing we have to work through our clients with is do you have true AI or are you just saying you have AI? Because there's also a disconnect right now of companies saying on their websites that they have an AI algorithm, but then they're telling the FDA that, oh, it's a completely locked software, it has no AI in it whatsoever. I imagine there's going to be, at some point, that's going to be rectified, the disconnect right now, but right now we're seeing it. A true AI would be a algorithm that's actually learned from probably a large data set to be able to do a certain function. So again, things like eliminating bias and making sure you're training on appropriate data sets that are representative of the US population and are of sufficient size are all things are just the beginning points that you'll be thinking about as you have conversations with the FDA about it.
Another question is, do you have experience with the predetermined change control plan that the FDA rolled out a few months ago? How is that experience be, if so, and is the FDA really allowing you to change, or is it mostly just talk?
Yeah, that's a great question and a question we get a lot. So we've had experience with it, and our experience so far is it takes a lot to get a predetermined change control plan in place with the FDA. On the surface, from reading the guidance, it looks like it's somewhat simple. It's not. You should expect at least 3 to 4 pre-submissions or applications or touch points with them from you initially proposing one from to then being finally on board with it. So you have to think, is the effort that I'm putting in to put together this PCCP really worth it in the long term? Am I going to do I have enough changes coming down the pipeline that I'd normally have to pay for that can really utilize this? And then keep in mind, FDA still holds their own discretion on what they allow in a PCCP. So you shouldn't be thinking major changes here, even if that's maybe what you think from reading the guidance. Really think small things like minor software modifications, minor things that are almost a letter to file or memo to file to begin with. That's more or less what would go here. So our initial understanding experience so far is the amount of effort that's required to put these together is not as useful for a 510K product. It's be more useful for a PMA product where you have those larger user fees.
Cool. Another question, I guess, regarding your services. Do you ever get involved in discussion about what might be the best reimbursement code during your initial regulatory review?
Absolutely. So we kept telling all of our startups that when we do this initial regulatory strategy, you also have to do a reimbursement strategy as well. And they kept having really trouble finding people of quality to be able to do these strategies in the time point and price point they needed. So we've actually got a group of service providers who can do the initial reimbursement assessment at the same time. So sometimes we will recommend this depending on what the recommendations come out of the regulatory strategy report. If we find that there's two potentially viable pathways from a regulatory perspective, then we really want that to be settled from a reimbursement perspective, not from a what's the cheapest or quickest pathway, but what is going to achieve the most value from a reimburser perspective.
Hmm. Next question again about AI. Have you seen FDA approve any AI algorithms that have been actively training post approval or post clearance? So
No,
not just a trained algorithm, but continuous training over the time.
no, you should expect that it's going to be locked by the time you push it. And if you need to make, so it's just the same as a regular software platform. If you need to make changes, then you'll need to notify the FDA.
Cool. Another question. We use the FDA online tool. We are not meeting the definition of the medical device and SAMD. However, we are agnostic DST software platform. There are non-medical applications as well as healthcare/medical applications. How could we be certain as a class 1 510K exam versus a uplift to class 2? Is there any distinct qualifier?
No, so there's a lot of gray area in medical device regulation and classification. So again, you should to de-risk yourself from potential FDA audits, you should work with a regulatory person to make this analysis and put together the justification and have it on file. That's really the best way to safeguard yourself in the event of an audit.
Right. With the FDA harmonization to 1345, is it critical now to have a 1345 certification before you go for final submission?
So for 13485, FDA is basically, they've been wanting to harmonize with it for the last 20 years and they finally achieved that. So you need to have it. It's basically you had you if you sold in many different countries, you would harmonize the 13485 for the different countries, and then have this separate CFR checklist to show how you met the FDA ones, which were almost the same with some very minor differences. Now you just don't have to do that anymore. You can be in compliance with 13485.
Yeah, but unlike Europe, where I guess 1345 certification is kind of a prerequisite for CE mark, uh, I don't think the FDA is actually requiring you to have a certification. But do you recommend that before they go FDA clearance?
I mean, yeah, it depends what your overall strategy is. If you're already planning to pursue the European market or Health Canada, you might just go ahead and get that anyway, just to show it. We don't do quality, but I don't think it's absolutely required for your initial submission.
Cool. One last question. This again based on your services. So how is Mittal Consulting different from any other service provider?
Yeah, well, we're the only boutique consulting company of this size in the medtech industry who works on very complex or novel devices, which often go through breakthrough or de novo pathways. So we work with quite a few very groundbreaking technologies, which really have impact on improving patient healthcare and provider lives. Um, I've trained my team to be able to simplify everything, and so that's where they excel. They're all exceptional writers, and I truly believe, especially right now, that a poorly written submission can sink an FDA correspondence or sink an application. So no matter what AI tools or changes in administrations are there, a well-written device description is always well received and necessary to get less deficiency questions. And then we just have a solid, trusted industry connections as well. So we regularly provide those for our companies through their medtech journeys.
Cool. Hi, that was all the questions we had. Yeah, none of them coming. So thanks for your time, Kristen. Thanks for your time, audience. Ours and Mittal Consulting's contact information is on screen. We'll send you this recording, as we mentioned, at the end of the today, sometime today or tomorrow, and reach out to us or directly to Mittal Consulting if you have any questions, and we'll do our best to answer those in a timely manner. Thanks again, Kristen, for your time. And thanks again for everyone who joined. And you all have a great day. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much for having us and really great questions you guys had.